Dissertations of Sherlock Holmes, The Dundas Separation Case, is copyright 2025 by its author, Sandor Jay Sonnen. All rights reserved. Forward. Our father was never a man for conundrums. He generally can't solve puzzles, is put off by brain teasers, and is really bad at solving mysteries. This past summer, I visited him at his home at Atascadero State Hospital in our native California, where he is a resident patient in the section for those who cannot be found guilty of their crimes by the courts by reason of insanity. He doesn't mind his circumstance all that much, but he says he is rather bored arranging for the staff to sneak into his room his daily martini and cigar. Also, he says there appears to be no one at the hospital who remotely resembles Patricia Fearing, the physiotherapist at the health clinic nearby to Shrublands in Thunderball, who was portrayed in that movie by Molly Peters. Dad complains a lot. We visit him every month, and it makes him happy. His fellow inmates like him and tell him they think his name is kind of weird, but he's an okay guy. On our recent visit to see him, he told us of his adventures in London last autumn and how, due to a mix-up at the bank of Cox and Company at Charing Cross, he fell into possession of a battered tin dispatch box having on it the name John H. Watson, M.D., Late Indian Army, painted on the lid. He told us he planned on telling the bank's staff of their mistake, but only after he returned to America to organize the box for their benefit. A true humanitarian is our father. Throughout the following winter, Dad read all the papers inside the box. His attempt to make any sense out of its contents over time drove him insane. He said to us its record of outrageous circumstances, romantic cliches, and invented plot devices were so outrageous that one may as well wear an Inverness cape and deerstalker cap when walking around the city of London. Still, we sat by him as he gave us his views of Dr. Watson's fictional tales. My brother Greg secretaries our father's comments and tries his best to put all of it into comprehensible sentences. The result is this series of cases of one Mr. Sherlock Holmes, which appear to have either no satisfactory conclusion or are missing one or several elements related to their proofs, leaving Dr. Watson in the position of publishing them as a collection of speculative, what may have been novelties in the career of this Holmes dude. For this reason, it appears Watson chose not to publish them, but hold on to their papers in this dispatch box of his. I present now this series of Sherlock Holmes stories that, as my father puts it, are more akin to dissertations than events with genuine conclusions, though I must in advance apologize for Dad's occasional loss of realism during his analysis of what he has intended to present to a candid world. Michael Alexander Sonnen, San Francisco, California.
Dissertations of Sherlock Holmes. 1. The Dundas Separation Case by Sandor Jay Sonnen. I had set up camp at my old desk, which Holmes had not touched since I had moved out and commenced living with my wife. Armed with pencil and paper and a cigar, I began taking notes from Holmes's storytelling, beginning with when he was contacted to help with the Dundas matter. He had curled into his favourite chair and lit a particular pipe he tended to favour for happier memory and discussion, more than for deep thought. I have warned you, Watson, this matter concerning Mr. and Mrs. Dundas does not have a clean ending, and though my being called in to give my views on it satisfied the situation as far as any man could have taken it, I have for my troubles nothing but speculation, and ultimately what could only be classified as circumstantial evidence to support my theories. I have learned through many of life's lessons that a matter involving one person interacting with another, where emotions are concerned, does not always bring about a definite, conclusive result. In fact, it may be argued that a mixed, non-clean ending may be more the average than otherwise. This brought from my friend a bark of laughter. "Just so," said Holmes, playing with his pipe and looking up at me, but otherwise proving to be as comfortable as a cat, deepening into his chair. Mr. and Mrs. James and Clara Dundas reside beyond the tower, on Burr Street, and have been there since they married, I think 3 years ago. Mrs. Dundas leads a commonplace existence, and while it's fair to say no one visits her regularly, Mrs. Dundas does have her acquaintances from her sewing circle, of which she keeps company on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Clara's sister, Beatrice Higgins, having never married, makes her trek from Vaux Hall, where she is in service nearly every Sunday after church, to lunch with her sister and brother-in-law. but otherwise Mrs. Dundas leads a commonplace existence with no regular friendships. James Dundas works for a security firm guarding for important companies which contract with his employer. He works Mondays through Fridays and half-day Saturdays. His hire was firmed up by men in South Africa for whom he worked, gaining proficiency in his guard and security work. You will note, Watson, my use of the present tense. For while Mrs. Dundas had gone to live for a long weekend in rooms provided by their landlady, before moving in with her sister for a few weeks, Clara Dundas has since rejoined her husband, from whom she was briefly estranged, and they are once again together, their adventure now behind them. You have presented the matter in such a way that despite there being a couple at the heart of the event, no writer would be able to use any romance in the telling of the tale. I was not going to let Holmes use this opportunity to make merry over what he believed to be my inability to keep my storytelling in such a way that drama was preferred by me over scientific substance. "The story is yet young, my good fellow," was his retort. He puffed for a moment before regaining his former pace. James Dundas had a steady moment of pleasantry, of which he looked forward to on a daily basis. His dinner always had to include meat. He was partial to steak, and they were able to afford this on a daily basis. He did not have much of it, as he was generally not prone to eating too much food at mealtime as a rule. But the day's final meal, even on those occasions when it was a supper, had to include meat. He very much enjoyed his wife's preparation of it, and he was not in the least pernickety. So his wife's account of what had occurred under their roof as things became hard between them was not due to negligence of her marital duty. In fact, both parties stated Mrs. Dundas found imaginative ways, as best she could with ingredients and spice, to make their steak a highlight. This point is an interesting one. Strange, or more in fact, not strange at all. Every man has in his life's design a daily moment of pleasure that is for himself regardless of the outside world. His is similar to many men. A treat to look forward to at the end of a day's work, I had stopped my writing and had taken up my cigar, intrigued at my friend's focus on the esoteric. "Certainly," responded Holmes, "but you will remember that what brought us to this case was your faulty guess at what would have been the kernel of a marital discord, and your providing a stream of clichés, one after the other, which you believed would be the basis of many a separation or court action. For this reason, you will recall, I chose to set matters straight, arguing the realm of everyday life was more interesting than those of lurid fiction." "I remember," said I. "Well, here was an instance from real life, far more fascinating than any of these crime magazines that for sixpence will feature one event where a woman runs home, her clothing in tatters, and she the victim of an impossible assault, and in the same booklet, the Reverend Father of some out-of-the-way church secretly collecting the eyes from those corpses in his trust before burial. Here was a man of civility and calm demeanour by nature, who must have undergone some unknown mental transformation, such that he ends up concluding his dinners by taking out his false teeth and hurling them at his wife. His false teeth being made for him during a stay at the General Lying-in Hospital. His natural ones were deprived of him a few years previous, at age 18. The result of stray Xhosa warriors, who after the Kaffir Wars ended, preyed on the British who were still camped about various places, guarding cattle for ranchers. His party was attacked near the Amathol Mountains. A bullet to the mouth resulted in his being fitted for dentures, at what can only be thought of as an early age for such a medical procedure. And as an important aside, these men who hired him for guarding the colonial cattle ranch were those men who would form the London-based company where Dundas would become employed. This case involved the most common of our subjects acting in the most uncommon manner, in the heart of our city, with the usual strains on any marital relationship, but without the typical harms that often occur between men and women. No other woman, no drink, no physical harm, outside of the technical breach related to the false teeth striking Mrs. Dundas, though there was indeed a sympathetic landlady and sister, to make your guesses all the more ironic. But these women were at hand to ensure Clara Dundas had a roof over her head while she sorted out her domestic situation. They did not provide substance to any claim of injury caused by James Dundas. "Then where did you begin?" I asked Holmes. "When marital bliss, or at least mere satisfaction, is replaced by sorrows, its cause is typically one of two matters. Either the drudgery is too much for one or both, and we find them at the moment where misery has come to its head, or there was an event that took one of them or both of them out of their average circumstance. Such an event would be of the kind that an investigator could amass evidence. It has always been one of my cherished principles that for work to have occurred, something must have been moved, and that movement is measurable. It can be observed and its results assessed. However, there was no tragedy nor shift of lifestyle. There was no visibly new person who interrupted the daily life of either husband or wife. The initial police inquiry, caused by an identified woman in Clara Dundas's sewing circle, who feared for her safety based on the idea that her husband's throwing his false teeth at her might escalate to a grim eventuality, brought to light nothing different occurring in the previous months to bring about anything that would have import. The police would not, on the lone report of this sewing circle crone, make any call on the home. But this woman in the sewing circle did cause the constables who walk about just east of the tower to prick up their ears as they passed by the Dundas flat. "Wait a moment," I interjected. "Why do you phrase it as no visibly new person?" "You caught that, did you?" Holmes replied. "That is exactly what will evolve to become the heart of the matter. But for the purposes of the order of this history I am sharing with you, we have to postpone this path for a while." "You tried to slip that by me?" I smiled to my friend. Holmes equally smiled. "We will naturally get there. It does become the kernel of the narrative. But for now, we continue matters as they unfolded. Based on two raised voice arguments which could be heard by the constable in their neighbourhood, a two-striped man showed up at the door just after dinner the following evening. By his side was the neighbourhood constable, who heard the rows. But neither husband nor wife would make any complaint against the other, and the routine visit was written up as routine. Not having any evidence of an upset that came upon the two of them together, I was left with the idea that whatever happened, happened to the wife, and that became the catalyst for some undiscussed resentment harboured by the husband. That, at least, was where I began my study. I reflected on these words and said, "I have not forgotten you originally told me you were, as you put it, engaged in cleaning up some small points in connection with the Dundas matter. This has been on my mind since before I arrived. We shall see what the definition of some small points becomes in how you order your word usage. What is equally interesting is how you were brought in on the matter. In the business of Drebber's death, you were sought out by Messrs. Gregson and Lestrade. My wife knew of you through her former employer, Mrs. Forrester, and Miss Sutherland knew of you from Mrs. Etheridge. I am not prepared to accept you came involved in this case because either Mr. or Mrs. Dundas was a distant relation to the King of Bohemia. Just so, Doctor." To place your turn of phrase in Italian musical notation, your use of segue shows you to have at heart a writer's imagination. I think perhaps you have scored a point, and that it is I who should be offered by you a pinch of snuff. But to answer you directly, and if we are to engage in the cribbing of one another's statements, it was you who classified me as the unofficial advisor and helper to everybody who is absolutely puzzled throughout 3 continents. I was for a moment put off by this. I did know he would come around to how he became connected with the matter, so having shot my bolt about what had been on my mind, I let it rest. Instead, I spoke a sentence to place Holmes back on task. "So, the bobbies go round to the Dundas home and speak with them, then casually wonder at what kind of man James Dundas would be if he were dangerous." That is exactly what the 2 constables did. The corporal made a verbal report to his sergeant, and that man wrote it up in his own notes. This the sort of thing that does not become a part of the blotter, but is still recorded. The police in the area are made aware of something, and can build upon it if there is another queer happening, said I. As in most police work, though the writing of the unusual does not lead to anything special, the act itself is still done as a matter of form. My involvement came upon an act which does require investigation. That is, when this kind of claim is made, the official actor steps in. Despite the Dundases' aforementioned agreed statement that they did not want any official relief from the matter, a few days following the constable's visitation, Mrs. Clara Dundas requested her husband be examined, or at the very least officially questioned, in the matter of his sanity. Not in a police sense, but in a medical sense. Mrs. Dundas could not find a reason for her husband's conduct towards her. Why the throwing of the false teeth? It was such a specific and never before documented, repeated technical battery that besides its required follow-up by a professional from one of the hospitals the city has contracted for such work, it became the basis of snide remarks made by constables at the Met. For this reason, before this doctor visited the Dundas home, he and the constable who would accompany him came by to get my view about the matter. My being the unofficial advisor and helper to everybody who is absolutely puzzled, I told the doctor that, should any follow-up be needed, he could come back and discuss with me the situation. Dr. Kent returned the following day and told me of his conversation with Dundas and how the man exhibited no mental aberration whatsoever. Nor was he playing coy. Dundas was very direct when he told Dr. Kent, in matter-of-fact terms, that those things passing between a husband and wife are deeply intimate and without reproach by civil authority. When Dr. Kent said that was only for most cases, and only when conduct did not turn to a trespass of physical harm, or, in some cases, emotional harm. To this Dundas was silent and did not speak again until the doctor and constable rose, and James Dundas gave them a good evening. Matters appeared to be placed in such a way that neither the police nor the medico could cite some kind of formal action, I commented. You would think so. But another 2 days passed, and the constable who accompanied Dr. Kent visited me with news Mrs. Dundas, with the assistance of her sister, extricated herself from the circumstance. With the financial help of her sister, she moved out and into another home owned by their landlady. After a few nights there, the sister put her up at her own home in Epsom. The constable said that on the last evening, Mrs. Dundas was at their shared home. Mr. Dundas indeed threw his false teeth at her after their evening meal. Mrs. Dundas placed them on the dining room table, and her 2 bags already packed, she left and walked to her new 2-week temporary address. Afterward, she was removed to Epsom by her sister, accompanying her from that temporary home to her own house via the rails. For a few minutes, silence filled the living room as Sherlock Holmes began to refill his pipe, and I looked at a mess of scrapbooks scattered throughout the corner bookshelf. Apparently, my friend had stopped his previous occupation for another, and had left an untidy mess about that area of the room. While I thought of this, Mrs. Hudson entered and removed the remains of the tea service we had enjoyed. I ended my cigar. I looked down at the notes I had made and wondered whether there would be any string to connect the series of incoherent acts, the central culprit being Mr. James Dundas. Then Watson. Holmes had interrupted my meandering thoughts. Without any expectation, James Dundas upstages his own folly with a new and exotic scheme, one of which no one was prepared. I called upon Sergeant Marshal Briar at his desk and learned that he had been visited by Mr. Dundas himself, who wanted to know about whether the constables who walk the neighbourhood had observed during the past week any person out of the ordinary. The sergeant pressed him on what he might mean, and Dundas specified, any person who a constable would not have observed not to be a regular character from the community. Briar wavered over the idea of writing out this matter, the folder of the Dundas case already being nothing more than purposeless statement after purposeless statement, and why should he pad it with yet another meaningless report? The following day I received a message from the constable, who walks Baker Street. It was a sealed envelope, and inside was a letter from Sergeant Briar, asking me to revisit him, but to do so on his lunch hour at the pub nearby to his station. I saw him there at what he told me was his usual booth. This pub, by the way, has a proprietor, who is a former member of the Coldstream Regiment, who served in the Crimean War, and was decorated for services at Sevastopol. He came over to the sergeant's table, quite a solid fellow with a never-ending stream of good humour. He encourages any man in uniform to frequent his establishment. Many in police uniform do not always want to be seen taking their lunch or dinner in public, and when I was there, I saw this veteran's tavern is frequented by many men from the Met. I had lunch with Sergeant Briar, and he told me a bit of a weird tale, and would I carefully, and without any fanfare, look into something for him, and not do anything about it, but come to him after I completed my task. What was the strange story he gave to you? That the day before Mr. Dundas entered the post office on Commercial Road, the office which serves his block, and there he stood about the place for an hour, doing nothing but watching every person, especially postal officer, as they entered and exited the building, staring at them with, according to the assistant postmaster, scorn. One of the employees recognized Mr. Dundas and told his superior, this assistant postmaster, and after some time the assistant postmaster approached Dundas and asked him if he could be of assistance. He was given a curt no, without Dundas' eyes ever meeting the other man's eyes. Dundas continued his observations for perhaps another quarter hour, until the officer summoned the courage to again walk over to where Dundas stood and told him he had to conduct some kind of postal business or leave. Dundas made to the man the obvious question that the office was indeed a public one. The assistant postmaster said to him it was that, but only for the conducting of business related to the mails. Dundas said to him, I am here on business related to the mails. In saying this, he turned and looked over the man from head to toe, once more with the scorn he had demonstrated since entering. Another few minutes went by with the assistant postmaster not leaving the area of the central counter, standing beside his two office employees as they completed their work with one customer after another. Determining to end the stalemate, this assistant, using obvious flourish to show he meant business, wrote a note and spoke loud enough for Dundas to hear that one of the postal employees should go straight away to the constabulary and bring a man back to the post office. This had the desired effect, and soon after witnessing the employees leaving, Dundas himself left the post office. It is interesting, is it not, Watson, that James Dundas is able to furnish us with two completely bizarre forms of behaviour, each on their surface merely strange, but each foreboding and with the potential to become dangerous. I smiled up at Holmes from where I sat, puffing on my Havana as he luxuriated with his churchwarden. He grinned back at me. We shared a moment's laughter at the character of Dundas and his strange actions. But like the question Dundas had made about any strangers lurking about on his block, this action of visiting the post office had the same philosophical basis, in that it implied he believed there had been some kind of event to cause him to be suspicious of something, and one wonders whether that something would manifest itself during the times he would be at work and his wife would be at home. You are giving me another example of your ability to reason backward to achieve a conclusion. You started with the throwing of the false teeth and have used that as the basis of everything James Dundas has done afterward, which is just as strange. I made a side note on my paper, making as best I could a chain of phrases, so I would have some type of cause and effect record of my friend's mental scheme. When you work on making some type of deduction from as minimal of information as you might have, such as here in the Dundas case, how do you direct your mind to fill in the blanks? Well, I cannot use any imagination to paint a non-existent picture. Such an attempt clutters the mind with hopes and dreams and makes for a very poor scientific method. Directing my mind always requires data. Always. Give me puzzles wrapped in enigmas, but by all means give to me all of the information associated with the conundrum itself, and it becomes quite clear over time. Over time, the mist evaporates, and the truth remains. The data of the false teeth and post office visit is so far meaningless, and at this point you are entirely stymied. Consider, Doctor. You have before you an important surgery requiring the use of a specific tool from 4 possible choices of tools, but it must be the correct one that you reach for. But you can only know which to use after your assistant moves a given area of tissue within the thoracic cavity that lays before you. Will you take hold of one of the 4 without knowing which is to be used, merely as a matter or form, or guesswork based upon what has probably occurred, or because you have a prejudice in favour of that given instrument? No, indeed. We are trained to wait until the area is fully exposed and the knowledge given us by the discovery of what is the matter. One does not guess at such a juncture until one sees the given circumstance. I would also be permitted the same appreciation for my acumen. Waiting for a new development and what that may bring is very much a part of the game. neither the official nor unofficial consultant is spared from this aspect of the profession. Professional or, he looked down at himself in a self-deprecating manner. Amateur, both are equal in this regard, but you had organised matters such that you could receive reports from one of a few quarters, was all that came to mind once my friend had finished. Yes, I had not been idle. I had several threads from which to rely, and sadly, I would have to wait for them to come to me and furnish me with my data. I had the sergeant at the station, the constables on the beat, the assistant at the post office who would report to the police any further action on the part of Dundas. I had this medico from the hospital. I even had the odd crone or two and Mrs. Dundas's sister who might, through the police, convey any given fear they would have developed through knowledge of another of Mr. Dundas's bizarre behaviours. From where, then, did your data finally emerge? 1 week after the event at the post office, Dr. Kent, from the school at Borough, came to see me, but this time alone and on his own volition. You will recall that at our last meeting I mentioned to you that I had been busy with nearly a dozen minor matters, and these required so little of my abilities that the Dundas puzzle had become a welcome retreat from the boredom of the others. But his report to me was only one sentence that he wished to reiterate, as he implied this to me at our first meeting. He said to me that after reviewing his notes from a series of questions he had put to James Dundas, he concluded the man to be of sound mind. He told me he had reviewed his notes because of the incident at the post office I had already known about. That is, he received a note from that sergeant at the Met, who described to him the unusual activity in the lobby of the post office, and would Dr. Kent reconsider his view on Mr. Dundas when it came to his mental state. The doctor said he gave it some thought and decided no. His original opinion was good at the time he had interviewed Dundas and was still good analysis. Dr. Kent said to me, "There is nothing wrong, mentally, with James Dundas." That was the entire purpose of Dr. Kent's visit. It caught me by surprise. I thanked the gentleman and returned to settle a few of these lesser cases I told you had occupied my time, and presented my opinions to those clients, and afterward had a pipe and thought over Dr. Kent and his statement. If there was no connection between a mental illness and a decision to throw one's dentures across a dinner table, and at a person one has come to love, there must be a reason for the act that would make sense in the real world. And if we are to believe there was a connection between this strange technical battery and the visit to the post office, then something must have arisen in the mind's eye of Mr. Dundas before the need to visit the post office became a determined event. Then following this reasoning, there would have been an incident that would have occurred that would have put Mr. Dundas on the alert that there was something having to do with a stranger walking the neighbourhood, and that this stranger had some connection to the local post office. I coupled these thoughts with the idea that there had already been a moment causing him to stew over this thing every day, resulting in his becoming angry at his wife. What could it be? And more interestingly, how and why would Dundas form the intelligence that such a stranger existed? After all, he worked 6 days a week, and that had been my faulty reasoning. He in fact did not work 6 days each week, he worked 5.5 days. The late Saturday post, I ejaculated. Yes, exactly. And when I combined the visit by Dundas to the post office, his inquiry over any out-of-the-norm person walking his community, and his throwing his false teeth at his wife, I determined at the heart of matters I would find a man who brought to James Dundas consternation. That such a man wore a postal uniform and therefore was a letter carrier, and that this man had for some outlandish reason made Mr. Dundas think about his injury from his time in South Africa. Well, I looked to my friend in bewilderment. Sherlock Holmes merely smiled at my failure to complete my thought. You are there, but you are unable to perceive what is before you. Mr. Dundas had asked about who, out of the ordinary, may have been in the community during the past week. Only the past week. And now we have the depth of this problem. Now we have an understanding why the man might have shown his anger by throwing his false teeth at his wife for some time. This is a mystery that dates back for some time, only culminating in a fit of anger, because he himself knows that there has been a certain someone who has re-entered his world, or more specifically, the world of his wife. Now, Doctor, I will offer you the choice. I can tell you first what I did to get at this solution, or I can instead allow you to experience what happened next in this drama, without any foreknowledge, attempting to figure out what happened in the matter of Mr. and Mrs. Dundas, as it unfolded, you are offering to me a game. Exactly that. Yes, it did become a game. Care to play? It did not take me long to decide that a game would be more inviting. I said so to my friend. He smiled, only slightly at first, and then broadly. Well then, friend Watson, here's where I stood. I had before me a stage of a community of suburban homes on the lower middle strata, peopled by a host of regulars, generally known by the residents, where someone out of the ordinary would be identified nearly as soon as he entered upon that stage. And the very next day after Dr. Kent came to see me, word circulates among the neighbours that a postman, perhaps with a seemingly furtive manner and without any mailbag for deliveries, had been walking some of the avenues. Those in the community took note of this because whoever he was, his presence on particular streets did not coincide with what many of the wives knew to be the regular times for expected postal deliveries at their homes. Strange, I commented immediately, not allowing my friend's narrative to evolve. Any such person, if not a genuine postal servant, would be quickly noticed and questioned by those living in the community. One cannot make a disguise of a postman and attempt to wear it before the public. Any number of things could go wrong. He may be questioned by a local, and having no reasonable retort, he would be remembered, and eventually, when a constable walked by, reported. He may be stopped, in fact, by a constable. What about the genuine article? Certainly a letter carrier knows a counterfeit when he sees one. This postman acting in a so-called furtive manner, if he was not the real thing, was taking an extraordinary gamble. How did word reach you that some of the residents observed this man walking in the Dundas neighbourhood? Through a note sent to me from the same desk sergeant. Sergeant Breyer. I remembered his name. Through his constables, Sergeant Breyer offered no out-of-the-ordinary person who walked the several blocks which made up the Dundas neighbourhood. Meaning what, Watson? Meaning whoever this man was, he had to be a letter carrier who had decided on his own to walk the streets of where the James and Clara Dundas lived. But only the one time. Holmes confirmed. He wished to be near to Clara Dundas, if only to see her from afar. I concluded, observing Holmes give to me a reaction of complete agreement. You have just scored 100 at playing our game. Holmes sat back in his chair and blew rings of smoke in self-satisfaction. Now, you will share with me the denouement of this matter, said I. Getting at the truth required a specific method and placement of the persons of the drama. I had to see them in a certain order and away from one another, which in this case was easier than one may imagine, because of how Mrs. Dundas had removed herself from her home, and each of the three parts of this would-be triangle were already separate, and if I played matters correctly, they would not balk at furnishing me with answers. Who would be first? I asked my friend. Naturally, Mrs. Dundas. She was the most susceptible to a conversation of this kind, and in fact had to know the name of her former sweeter from several years previous. During a time when her husband was in South Africa, completing his security work for what would be his London employer. During the time of his injury, when his teeth were destroyed before age 22 or thereabouts, I contributed. Yes, when he went away and expected his intended, or betrothed, or however then Miss Clara was placed, to wait for him and not signal by means of action or inaction, that advances by another would be welcomed. You did not know what had happened on that account, Holmes, I interjected. She may have been completely innocent and told this other man she had no interest in his advances, whether such advances have been serious or subtle. Which was another reason for why I should approach her first, he responded. In such a situation, any person, especially a woman, need be reassured that a matter involving a question of her participation in intrigue must be put to rest after her husband acted in such a way that his conduct brought to the surface some form of wonder. Did she participate? I prodded. I had from the landlady her sister's address, and I travelled to Epsom, and here is where the lady attempted to play coy. But I did have my one trump inadvertently provided me by Clara Dundas herself. There I am stumped, I said. I will not spin out this narrative and share with you the kindness I attempted to convey to the lady. For what is important is she gave me nothing in return for what I lay before her. I explained her husband's use of his teeth, bringing me to believe the matter related to his time away from her, and what he lost in preparing for their future, his work for this security company of which he became employed, but at the cost of his teeth completely destroyed. I brought up her husband's probable observations of this man who had showed her interest when her intended was in colonial parts. I brought up his visiting the post office and his presumption that his man is no ghost from her past, but is genuine in his affection and inability to shake from his mind thoughts of her, regardless of how remote any union with this man could possibly manifest. Again, no response. Sherlock Holmes made his frustration palpable. This trump card of yours, I looked to my friend with all seriousness, that she had herself called upon a medical professional to examine him, when she failed to give valuable information that would corroborate that. Her husband was acing in perhaps a dramatic fashion, but she knew from the outset he was not mentally ill, and she had brought his sanity into question when she knew better. That is very serious, said I. One is not allowed to use such an accusation to feather their own point of view and deny a finder of fact details that, in such a circumstance, would hold weight in an accused disposition. She gave me a name. I promised her it would go no further than those involved, who already know this name. If her husband knew he was a letter carrier, it must be presumed he knew of the man and the man's attentions toward his hopeful fiancée. Yes, agreed Holmes, such had to be the case. So James Dundas saw this man walk about his streets, and his wife was not aware such was the case, and his response was to throw his false teeth at his wife. Which meant, Watson, that he never shared with his wife that he knew of this former would-be suitor, roaming the neighbourhood, and observing her and wondering what his chance, if any, may be. How then went your interview with James Dundas? So, Watson, you are sufficiently placed in your mind that the husband would be my next port of call. Well, Holmes, it would be more accurate to say that I understand that whoever this mystery man is, he would be your last port of call. At least, that is how I reasoned matters. Very good, Watson. A perfect understanding of gamesmanship. Always serve last in order the culprit of any design. Your interview with friend Dundas must have been succinct. Very. I told him where matters stood, and without naming the man I told him I knew who he was, and that he was a postal officer who had travelled outside of his area to observe the Dundas home and possibly his wife, and that now he had been identified, there would be no benefit to his return, as should he play at his antics again, all would come out, and he would not only lose his position, but be viewed with disgust by any who would reflect upon his character. And Dundas was shrewd enough to understand such an opinion of the man would follow him for years, and eventually be talked about and understood by anyone and everyone who would matter to him. But he gave me nothing back. Like the same men who had spoken with him over the past several weeks, his was a stone-faced non-response. There was no prodding the man, and he remained unmoved. No words, no nod of the head for my troubles, no observable admission that I had struck gold. The responses so many had received before me appeared to be a deeply ingrained aspect to the man. I left him without any confirmation. And you then visited this man of mystery? I looked to my friend with a pitiable expression. For some reason I'm feeling sorry for the man. Yes, he replied, for however he became the way he became, he may have a good heart, broken by an unrequited love, caused by nothing more than unfortunate timing. He's probably not the only man in the world to look in on what could have been, motivated by no more than a longing in his heart. I suppose with a name you soon had a face. Then you soon had an address. No man with a name and position can hide from the world. And naturally he was not hiding. I waited for him to end a day's work, leaving the very same post office where James Dundas had spent an hour standing in the centre of its service area. No matter how you approached the man, at his home or the public house he may have frequented or tending to his gardening, your introduction and request for a conversation would have brought nothing but a defensive and eventually sorrowful reaction. The best of all of these would near to where he works. No man wants to be bothered when at or nearby their home. I introduced myself and suggested we walk to a park bench. When he responded with a desire to disengage and go about his way, I mentioned I wished to speak with him about his walking a particular neighbourhood. I then decided I was not going to be the man's supplicant, so I turned and walked to that park setting I mentioned, and he eventually caught up with me and followed me to a convenient bench. "Were you kind to the man?" I asked. I certainly didn't see him as a criminal, and I wondered whether to classify him as a wrongful actor. I simply told him he had to cease at what he was playing at. Did you get the idea that he would desist in his actions? Watson, he gave me the same response as the other two. Though Mrs. Dundas gave me a name, she admitted to nothing. Though James Dundas gave me an interest in my investigation, he admitted to nothing. This man was of the same mould, but in his case you have a man who had to have made some kind of travel into a neighbourhood that was not a part of his postal route. And what can I do with that? We already agreed this man may not be a villain, so why should I work to place myself in such a role? Holmes said to me with quiet assurance. There was a quiet in the sitting room until I said to my friend, "It can be argued that you certainly did clear up some of the points in the matter of the separation of James and Clara Dundas. You said to me their estrangement has ended, and they are once more under one roof. Sergeant Breyer has sent word to me that such is the case." "One can hope," said I, "that Mr. Dundas finds his way to keeping his dentures inside of his mouth, no longer using them as a projectile." Holmes looked up at me and smiled an enigmatic smile, before once more folding his legs and fitting more deeply into his chair. The Dundas separation case is dedicated to Richie Galdieri.